If you have to ask who he is, you're already in the wrong room. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but they hung in the air the moment the old man refused to answer. Inside Tactical Operations Room B, the hum of monitors and low chatter died one sound at a time, like a switch being flipped across the room. Captain Ryan Cole stood at the center, posture rigid, jaw tight, every inch the image of authority he'd spent years building. And in front of him, just 10 feet away, stood a man who didn't look like he belonged anywhere near a restricted military briefing. Thomas Vance didn't wear rank. No patches. No insignia. Just a worn field jacket, faded at the elbows, and boots that had seen more miles than most of the men in that room combined. His hands rested loosely at his sides, fingers still, not a tremor, not a twitch. His eyes didn't wander. They didn't challenge either. They simply observed, steady and quiet, like he'd already measured everything in the room and found it lacking urgency. "I'll say this one more time," Cole snapped, his voice cutting through the silence with a sharp, practiced edge. "Identify yourself or step out. This area is restricted." A few heads nodded. A few smirks followed. To them, this was routine. Another civilian who wandered too far, another interruption to a tightly scheduled operation. But something about the old man didn't fit the pattern. Specialist Aaron Blake, seated behind a bank of terminals, felt it first. Not in anything the man said, because he hadn't said anything, but in the way he stood. The stillness. The lack of reaction. Blake had seen that kind of composure before, but never in someone dressed like that. Cole took a step forward, boots echoing softly against the polished floor. "You hearing me?" he pressed, voice lower now, more controlled, more dangerous. That's when the old man finally moved. Not a flinch. Not a shift. Just a slow turn of his head, eyes settling on Cole like the room had narrowed down to a single point. And then he spoke. Calm. Measured. Almost quiet enough to miss. "You already have the answer, Captain." The words didn't land like defiance. They landed like fact. A ripple passed through the room. Someone let out a short laugh. Another officer shook his head, muttering under his breath. To them, it sounded like nonsense. Evasion. Maybe even arrogance. Cole's expression hardened, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Then enlighten us," he said, folding his arms, confident now. Behind him, Blake's fingers hovered over his keyboard. Something about that sentence didn't sit right. It wasn't what was said. It was how it was said. He glanced back at the old man, then down at his terminal. Slowly, almost instinctively, he typed in the name he'd overheard at the door just minutes earlier. Thomas Vance. The system blinked. Then stalled. And for the first time that day, Specialist Aaron Blake felt his pulse shift. The cursor blinked once, then again, before the system responded in a way Blake had never seen before. Not an error. Not a delay. A lock. Red text did not flash. No alarm sounded. The screen simply stopped where it was, as if the system itself had decided it was no longer authorized to continue. Blake frowned, leaning closer, his fingers hovering just above the keys. He had clearance. Level 3. Enough to access operational data, personnel records, even restricted flight logs under supervision. But this was something else. He tried again, slower this time, re-entering the name with careful precision. Thomas Vance. The result came faster, but it did not change. Access restricted. Clearance override required. His throat tightened slightly. That message did not appear for ordinary personnel. Not even for classified contractors. This was the kind of flag tied to files that did not exist in normal channels. Files that were buried. Sealed. Forgotten on purpose. Behind him, Captain Cole let out a quiet scoff, misreading the silence at the terminals as hesitation. "What is it now?" he asked, turning slightly, his tone edged with impatience. "System giving you trouble, Specialist." Blake did not answer right away. His eyes flicked back to the old man, still standing in the same spot, posture unchanged, as if none of this concerned him. That calm, it was not passive. It was controlled. Deliberate. The kind of calm Blake had seen once before, years ago, when a retired command sergeant major had walked through a training exercise and dismantled an entire plan with a single question. This felt the same. Only heavier. Blake swallowed and reached for a secondary channel, one that required a physical key inserted into the side panel of his terminal. He hesitated for half a second, aware of the room, of the eyes, of the fact that this was no longer routine. Then he turned the key. The system shifted. A deeper layer opened, slower, quieter. Lines of encrypted text scrolled briefly before resolving into a single line that made his chest tighten. Record classification, command level. Access logged. He exhaled slowly, almost forgetting to breathe. That level did not belong to civilians. It did not belong to contractors. It belonged to names that moved through the system without leaving tracks. Captain, Blake said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier casual tone. Cole did not turn immediately. If this is about a missing file, handle it, he replied, dismissive. We are in the middle of a briefing. Blake shook his head, even though Cole could not see it. It is not missing, he said. It is locked. That word hung differently. Cole turned this time, irritation sharpening into focus. Locked, he repeated, stepping closer. Everything is locked to someone, specialist. That is how clearance works. Blake looked up at him, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that did not belong in a room like this. Uncertainty. Sir, this is command level. Not regional. Not operational. Command. The room shifted again, subtle but real. Conversations that had been whispering at the edges stopped completely. Even the hum of the equipment seemed louder now. Cole's jaw tightened, but he said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved from Blake, back to the old man. Thomas Vance had not moved. Not an inch. He was still watching, still silent, as if he had seen this exact moment play out before. And was simply waiting for it to catch up. Captain Cole did not speak right away. He studied the old man the way a person studies something that refuses to fit into a known pattern. 10 feet apart, but the distance felt wider now, stretched by something no one in the room could name. The air had shifted, not louder, not quieter, just heavier, as if every sound had to push through resistance to exist. Command level, Cole repeated slowly, the words measured this time, stripped of their earlier edge. He did not look at Blake when he said it. His eyes stayed locked on Thomas Vance. You are telling me this man, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Blake nodded once, small, controlled, but unmistakable. Yes, sir. No one laughed now. The earlier smirks were gone, replaced by stillness that spread from one person to the next like a silent signal. Even the officers who had not been paying attention before were watching now, their posture subtly adjusting, shoulders straightening without being told. Cole took another step forward, slower this time, as if closing the gap required more thought than before. Mr. Vance, he said, the title different now, no longer dismissive, but not yet respectful either. Somewhere in between. If you have command-level classification, then you also understand protocol. He paused, searching for ground that still felt solid beneath his authority. You do not just walk into a restricted operations room and stand silent. The old man listened. That was all he did. No reaction. No defense. Just listening, as if the words mattered, even if the outcome did not. Cole's jaw tightened. So I am going to ask you again, he continued, his voice steady but quieter now, less for the room and more for the space between them. State your purpose. For a moment, nothing happened. The kind of nothing that stretches just long enough to become noticeable. Then Thomas Vance drew a slow breath, the movement subtle, almost invisible unless someone was watching for it. His gaze did not shift. "I am here," he said, each word placed carefully, "because someone thought you needed a second look." The sentence did not explain anything. It did not clarify his role, his authority, or his reason for being there. But it landed with weight, the kind that did not need detail to be understood. Cole blinked once, just once, the reaction so small it could have been missed. But Blake saw it. And so did a few others. Because something in that sentence did not sound like a request. It sounded like a decision that had already been made somewhere higher than this room. Behind Cole, one of the lieutenants shifted his stance, boots adjusting against the floor, a reflexive movement that mirrored the tension building in the room. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The chain of command still held, but it was no longer the only force in the room. Blake glanced back at his terminal. The screen had not changed. Command level. Access logged. The system had recorded the attempt. Somewhere, someone else could see it now. He felt it, that quiet awareness spreading through him, the realization that this moment was no longer contained within these four walls. Cole exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, deliberate. He had spent years learning how to command a room, how to project certainty even when variables shifted. But this was different. This was not uncertainty. This was absence of information in a place that depended on it. His eyes narrowed slightly. And who, he asked, carefully, made that decision? For the first time, there was the faintest shift in Thomas Vance's expression. Not a smile. Not even close. Just a slight softening around the eyes, like someone hearing a familiar question asked by someone new. He did not answer immediately. He did not need to. Because at that exact moment, the door behind them opened without a sound, and the room changed again before a single word could be spoken. The door did not slam. It did not creak. It simply opened, quiet enough that the sound was almost imagined, yet every head in the room turned at the exact same time. Colonel Daniel Mercer stepped in without urgency, but the effect of his presence moved faster than any command ever could. Conversations that had already faded now vanished completely. Even Captain Cole straightened, instinct overriding thought, his posture tightening by a fraction that only trained eyes would notice. Mercer did not speak. He did not acknowledge the room, not at first. His gaze moved once across the space, quick. Precise, taking in the officers, the terminals, the tension hanging like weight in the air. Then his eyes stopped. Locked. On Thomas Vance. The distance between them was not more than 15 feet, but it carried something heavier than rank. Blake felt it from across the room, a shift so subtle it could not be measured, yet impossible to ignore. Mercer's expression did not change. No surprise. No confusion. Just recognition. Immediate. Absolute. Captain Cole opened his mouth, ready to report, to regain control of the situation before it slipped further from his grasp. "Colonel, we have..." Mercer raised a single hand. Not sharply. Not aggressively. Just enough. The words stopped before they fully formed. The room held its breath. The colonel took 2 steps forward, slow, deliberate, the polished floor barely echoing beneath his boots. His attention never left Vance. Not for a second. It was not inspection. It was not suspicion. It was something closer to confirmation. As if he had been given a name and had just found the man attached to it. No one moved. Not even Blake. His eyes flicked between the 2 men, trying to read something, anything that explained what he was witnessing. But there were no signals he recognized. No visible exchange. No coded language. Just silence. Mercer stopped 3 feet in front of Vance. Close enough that the difference between them was no longer physical, but something else entirely. For a moment, nothing happened. The kind of stillness that stretches just long enough to become unbearable. Cole felt it, a pressure building behind his ribs, the instinct to fill the silence clashing with the unspoken understanding that speaking now would be a mistake he could not take back. Vance did not move. He did not salute. He did not introduce himself. He simply stood, the same calm, the same quiet control that had unsettled the room from the moment he entered. Mercer's eyes held his for one long second. Then two. And in that pause, something passed between them that required no words, no explanation, no witness. Recognition did not need translation. The colonel gave the smallest nod. Not exaggerated. Not ceremonial. Just a single, deliberate movement of the head. And it was enough. The effect was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. But total. Captain Cole felt it first, the sudden, undeniable shift in weight, as if the ground beneath his authority had quietly realigned. The officers along the wall straightened further, their earlier uncertainty replaced by something closer to awareness. Blake exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. The system had been right. Whatever this was, it had never belonged to them. Mercer lowered his hand, finally turning his gaze toward Cole, but only briefly. "Continue," he said, his voice calm, even, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everything had. Because when he stepped slightly to the side, not in front of Vance, not behind him, but beside him, the message became clear in a way no report ever could. No one in that room outranked silence when it was backed by truth. For a moment, no one knew where to look. The room had not changed in shape or structure, the same screens glowing, the same maps frozen mid-brief, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it all, something invisible yet undeniable. Captain Cole felt it settle in his chest, not like pressure, but like absence, as if the certainty he had walked in with had quietly stepped aside without asking permission. He cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended, and turned back toward the central display. "We were reviewing sector allocation," he said, his voice steady but lower now, recalibrated without announcement. No one questioned the change. No one acknowledged it. But everyone heard it. Behind him, Colonel Mercer remained still, hands loosely at his sides, his presence no longer interrupting the room, but anchoring it. And beside him, Thomas Vance had not moved. He did not look at the screens. He did not study the data. His attention rested somewhere else, as if the information on the wall was already familiar, already processed long before this briefing had begun. Blake glanced back at his terminal, the red text still faintly glowing at the edge of his vision. Command level. Access logged. He swallowed, then slowly minimized the window, not because the information had changed, but because he understood now that it was not meant for him to see. Cole continued, pointing at a section of the map with a measured hand. Primary concern is the eastern corridor, approximately 12 miles from the perimeter. Satellite data shows irregular movement patterns, nothing confirmed, but enough to justify a closer look. His words flowed, professional, controlled, but there was a difference now. A slight hesitation between sentences. A subtle awareness that he was no longer the highest point in the room. One of the lieutenants nodded, taking notes, but his eyes flicked once, just once, toward Vance, as if trying to reconcile the quiet man with the shift he could feel but not explain. Cole noticed it. Of course he did. He noticed everything. And for the first time since stepping into command, he let the silence sit for a fraction longer than necessary before continuing. "We will deploy a reconnaissance team at 0600 hours, he said, then paused, just enough for the words to settle. It was not hesitation. It was consideration. And that was new. Behind him, Mercer's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the map, not toward the officers, but toward Vance. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. Not instruction. Not correction. Just a question without words. And for the first time since the colonel entered the room, Thomas Vance moved. It was not dramatic. Not even noticeable unless someone was watching closely. His head tilted a fraction, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest focus. He looked at the map now, not scanning, not searching, but seeing. The room felt it again. That quiet shift. Blake leaned forward without realizing it, his attention pulled toward the exchange like gravity. Cole stopped speaking mid-thought. Not abruptly. Not awkwardly. Just stopped. Because something in the room had told him to. Vance took a single step forward, closing the distance to the display by less than a foot. His hand did not rise. He did not point. He simply looked. "You are watching the wrong line," he said, his voice calm, even, the same tone as before, but now it carried something else. Not authority. Not exactly. But certainty. Absolute and unshaken. Cole's eyes flicked to the map, then back to Vance. "Excuse me," he asked, the question automatic, but the challenge behind it softer than it would have been minutes ago. Vance did not look at him. "The movement is not in the corridor," he said. "It is just outside of it. About 3 miles west. You are tracking the shadow, not the source." The word settled into the room with a weight that did not need volume. Blake's fingers moved before he could stop himself, pulling up the satellite feed again, adjusting the parameters, shifting the focus slightly west. The screen refreshed. And for a second, nothing changed. Then the pattern appeared. Subtle. Faint. But there. A deviation no one had marked. No one had seen. Until now. Blake's breath caught. "Sir," he said, barely above a whisper. Cole did not respond. He was staring at the screen, the realization unfolding in real time, piece by piece, as the data aligned with what had just been said. Slowly, almost carefully, he turned his head back toward Thomas Vance. And this time, there was no challenge left in his expression. Only the beginning of understanding. No one spoke when the pattern appeared. It was not dramatic. It did not flash or trigger alarms. It simply existed on the screen, quiet and undeniable, like it had been there all along waiting for someone who knew where to look. Specialist Blake leaned closer, adjusting the zoom by a fraction of an inch, his fingers moving slower now, more deliberate, as if speed might disturb something fragile. The faint movement line sharpened, revealing a rhythm that did not belong to random drift. It was controlled. Intentional. And completely missed until now. 3 miles west, Blake murmured under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Captain Cole did not respond. He stood still, eyes locked on the data, replaying the last 30 seconds in his mind with a precision that came from training, but also from something else now. Awareness. He had seen the same feed. Reviewed the same data. Signed off on the same interpretation. And yet he had been looking exactly where he was supposed to look. That was the problem. Slowly, he reached for the console beside him, pulling up the overlay himself, confirming what Blake had already uncovered. The system did not argue. It never did. It simply reflected what it was given. And now, it reflected something different. Behind him, Colonel Mercer had not moved, but his attention had shifted fully to the screen. Not surprised. Not impressed. Just watching. The way someone watches a result they already expected. Thomas Vance stood just to the side of the display, hands still at his sides, his posture unchanged. He did not step forward. He did not elaborate. He did not claim anything. The correction had been made. That was enough. One of the lieutenants, a young officer barely out of advanced training, took a half-step closer to the screen, his voice cautious. "Sir, that changes the approach vector by at least 2 degrees. If we had deployed based on the original line," he stopped himself before finishing the thought. He did not need to say it out loud. Everyone in the room could already see the difference. 2 degrees at that distance was not a minor adjustment. It was the difference between observing the situation and missing it entirely. Cole exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the edge of the console. "Update the projection," he said, his tone controlled, but quieter than before. "Adjust the reckon route to match the new data." Blake nodded immediately, already moving, recalibrating the path, watching as the projected route shifted across the screen. The new line cut closer to the pattern, aligning with the movement in a way that made the previous plan look incomplete. Not wrong. Just insufficient. Cole straightened, his shoulders settling into a new alignment, not losing authority, but reshaping it. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at Vance without fully facing him. "You saw that from a static display," he said, not a question, not quite a statement. Vance did not respond right away. His eyes remained on the map for a moment longer, as if confirming that the adjustment had been understood. Then he shifted his gaze back toward Cole. "It was not static," he said calmly. "You were just not watching the right movement." The words were not critical. They were not sharp. But they carried weight. Not the weight of correction. The weight of experience. Cole held his gaze for a second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own. Not the same as the Colonel's. Not as final. But it was there. An acknowledgment. Around the room, the tension had not disappeared. It had transformed. What had started as resistance had become attention. Focus. Every officer present was now watching the same man they had dismissed minutes ago, but the way they watched him had changed. Not with curiosity. With care. Because now they understood something they had not before. Silence, when backed by certainty, was not absence. It was control. Blake leaned back slightly from his terminal, his eyes drifting once more to the small corner of the screen where the classification had first appeared. Command level. Access logged. He no longer needed the system to tell him what that meant. He could see it standing 10 feet away from him. And for the first time since the briefing began, no one in the room was waiting for Thomas Vance to explain himself. They were waiting to see what he would notice next. The room did not return to normal. It settled into something sharper. Every movement became more deliberate, every word weighed before it was spoken, as if the presence of Thomas Vance had recalibrated the standard without anyone formally acknowledging it. Captain Cole stepped back from the console, not retreating, but repositioning, his posture no longer centered as the sole point of authority, but aligned within a structure that had quietly shifted around him. "Run a secondary sweep," he said, his voice even, directed at Blake. "Expand the scan radius by 5 miles beyond the new line. I want to know what we are not seeing yet." Blake nodded immediately, his fingers already moving, the keyboard clicking softly under controlled pressure. The system responded in layers now, data stacking over data, each adjustment revealing something just beneath the previous assumption. The map on the main screen shifted again, subtle overlays forming, patterns beginning to echo outward from the initial anomaly. One of the senior lieutenants leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Sir, there is a secondary drift forming further west. It is faint, but it follows the same rhythm." Cole did not answer right away. He looked at the screen, then, almost instinctively, glanced toward Vance. Not for permission. Not exactly. But for confirmation. Thomas Vance did not move. He did not step forward or correct the statement. He simply watched, his gaze tracing the expanded data the way someone reads something already familiar. After a moment, he gave the slightest incline of his head. Not a full nod. Just enough. It was all the confirmation Cole needed. "Mark it," Cole said immediately. "Adjust the reckon pattern again. We are not dealing with a single line. This is layered movement." The room responded faster now, the earlier hesitation replaced by precision. Officers shifted positions, notes updated, commands passed quietly between stations. What had started as a routine briefing had become something else entirely, something alive, unfolding in real time. Colonel Mercer remained where he was, his silence unchanged, but his presence now felt less like interruption and more like foundation. He watched the room adapt, watched the officers recalibrate, but his attention returned again and again to Vance. Not out of curiosity. Out of recognition. Because what was happening in that room was not being taught. It was being remembered. Blake leaned closer to his screen, pulling up additional feeds, cross-referencing the expanded pattern with older data logs. His brow furrowed as he scrolled back through archived movement records. "Sir," he said, slower this time, the word carrying more weight. Cole turned slightly. "What is it?" Blake hesitated for a fraction of a second, then spoke. "This pattern, it is not new. It has been here before. Months ago. We flagged it as environmental drift. Noise in the system." A quiet ripple moved through the room. Cole's expression tightened, not with frustration, but with realization. "We dismissed it," he said under his breath. Blake nodded. "Yes, sir." Cole's eyes shifted again, back to Vance. "You have seen this before," he said, more statement than question. Vance's gaze did not. "Leave the screen." "Not here," he replied calmly. "But it behaves the same." The answer did not explain everything. It did not need to. It pointed to something larger, something beyond the immediate data in front of them. Cole absorbed that, the pieces aligning in a way that made the earlier briefing feel incomplete. He straightened, turning back to the room. "We are revising the entire approach," he said, his voice firm now, not louder, but clearer. "No assumptions. No shortcuts. We follow the pattern, not the expectation." Around him, heads nodded, not out of obligation, but understanding. Because now they saw what they had missed. And more importantly, they understood how easily it could have stayed that way. Blake leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting once more toward Thomas Vance. The old man had not claimed anything. Had not explained his background, his rank, or his authority. But none of that mattered anymore. Because in a room built on data, precision, and command, he had done something no system could do. He had seen what everyone else had overlooked. And in doing so, he had shifted the entire room without raising his voice even once. The room moved with purpose now, but beneath the motion, something quieter had taken hold. It was no longer about proving who was right. It was about not missing what mattered. Captain Cole stood slightly off-center, no longer the sole focal point, yet not diminished. Just adjusted. His voice carried again, steady and precise. "Cross-check historical patterns against current drift," he said. "I want a full comparison over the last 12 months. No filters." Blake nodded, pulling deeper archives, the system responding slower now as it processed layers of data that had been ignored for too long. Lines began to overlap on the screen, faint echoes of the same pattern appearing at different intervals, spaced months apart, each one dismissed before it could be understood. A lieutenant exhaled softly. "We thought it was noise," he said, almost to himself. "It never repeated clean enough." "It did," Vance said quietly. "No one missed it this time." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Every person in the room heard it. With absolute clarity. Cole turned his head slightly. "Then why did it not register?" he asked. Vance's gaze remained on the screen. "Because you were waiting for it to match your expectation," he replied. "It never will." The word settled deeper than any correction before. Blake slowed his typing, letting that sink in. The system was built to confirm patterns, to validate assumptions. But what if the pattern was designed not to be confirmed? What if it only revealed itself when someone stopped expecting it to behave a certain way? Colonel Mercer watched the exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpened. He had seen this before. Not the data. Not the map. But the shift. The moment when a room stopped defending its assumptions and started questioning them. Cole stepped closer to the display again, but this time, his movement was different. Less force. More intent. "Run projection forward," he said. "If this pattern continues, where does it lead?" Blake entered the command. The system processed, lines extending beyond the current map, faint trajectories forming, not straight, not predictable, but consistent in their deviation. The projected endpoint appeared just beyond the perimeter zone, approximately 18 miles out. A location previously marked as low priority. Unremarkable. Until now. That sector was cleared last quarter, one of the officers said, confusion in his voice. Minimal activity. No strategic value. Vance finally shifted his gaze from the map to the officer. Not challenging. Not correcting. Just looking. That is why it works, he said. Silence followed. Not heavy this time. Not tense. Just complete. Because the logic was undeniable once spoken. Cole nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, thoughtful. Update priority, he said. That sector moves to primary focus. The officers responded immediately, no hesitation, no questioning. The room had changed. Not because of rank. Not because of command. But because something had been seen that could not be unseen. Blake leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting once more toward Vance. He tried to place him, to understand how someone could walk into a room, say so little, and yet shift everything. There were no records he could access. No rank he could verify. No file he could open. But none of that mattered anymore. Because the system had already answered the only question that mattered. And the colonel had confirmed it without a word. Across the room, Cole took a slow breath, then turned slightly toward Vance. Not fully. Not directly. But enough. We would have missed it, he said quietly. It was not an admission of failure. It was recognition. Vance did not respond. He did not need to. Because everyone in that room already knew the truth. Some corrections do not come from louder voices. They come from the ones that do not need to raise them at all. No one rushed to speak after that. The room, once driven by urgency and precision, now moved with something deeper, something steadier. The data on the screens continued to update, lines shifting, projections refining, but the real change had already happened. It was not in the system. It was in the people watching it. Captain Cole stood quietly for a moment longer, his eyes still on the map, but no longer searching for what was missing. He had already found it. Slowly, he turned, not toward the display this time, but toward Thomas Vance. The distance between them had not changed, but it no longer felt like a gap that needed to be closed. It felt understood. We will proceed with the revised plan, Cole said, his voice calm, grounded. Full adjustment to the western sector. No assumptions. We follow the pattern exactly. There was no hesitation in the response. The officers moved immediately, commands acknowledged, updates relayed. The room was no longer reacting. It was aligned. Behind them, Colonel Mercer took a single step back, his presence easing just enough to signal something unspoken. The moment had passed. Not because it was over, but because it had done what it needed to do. Blake watched it all from his terminal, his hands resting still now, the system running without him needing to push it further. His eyes shifted once more to the corner of the screen where the classification had first appeared. It had not changed. It did not need to. He understood now that some things were not meant to be accessed. They were meant to be recognized. Across the room, Thomas Vance remained where he had been, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. He did not look for acknowledgment. He did not wait for questions. The work in front of him was no longer his to do. It never had been. After a moment, he turned slightly, his gaze passing over the room one last time. Not inspecting. Not judging. Just seeing. Then he stepped away. No announcement. No request. Just a quiet movement toward the door. For a fraction of a second, no one reacted. Then, almost instinctively, Captain Cole straightened, his posture aligning in a way it had not before. It was not forced. It was not rehearsed. It was respect, arriving without instruction. One of the lieutenants mirrored the movement. Then another. Not a full salute. Not formal. But unmistakable. A recognition that did not require orders. Vance reached the door, his hand pausing briefly on the handle. He did not turn back. He did not say anything more. Because there was nothing left to explain. The door opened as quietly as it had before, and he stepped through it without breaking stride. The room remained still for a moment longer, as if holding onto something that had already passed. Then Colonel Mercer spoke, his voice even, steady. "Continue. Just one word." But it carried the weight of everything that had just happened. The officers returned to their stations, the briefing resuming, but not as it had begun. Something had been recalibrated, not in the system, but in the way they saw it. Blake exhaled slowly, his eyes lingering on the door long after it had closed. He realized then that he would never find a file that explained what he had just witnessed. No record. No rank. No